year is 1977, or as we say around here, 46 BT. That's before Taplines, listener. At this stage in American history, the outlook for full-flavored beer is dismal. This is the age of rapidly consolidating macro brewers and mass-produced adjunct lagers. Craft brewing isn't called microbrewing at this point. It just isn't really called much anything at all because it barely exists. So American drinkers who want malty, hoppy stuff have no choice but to head underground. In some cases, literally. See, through the end of 1977, U.S. federal law still required excise tax to be collected on fermented malt beverages, even if they were being produced for personal consumption, which effectively banned homebrewing. That doesn't mean people weren't making their own beer, mind you. They were in garages and closets and basements and cellars across the country. They were doing it on the sly. This isn't strictly speaking legal, but more importantly, time cop, it's holding the beer business back because hobbyists are trying to keep this practice out of the view of Uncle Sam and aren't able to share recipes and know-how with one another as easily as they might have liked. Brewing innovation is happening, but it's going slow. Then, in 1978, a certain peanut farmer from Georgia, John Hancocked an amendment to the federal tax code, allowing homebrewers to, emerge from the shadows and hone their beer-making skills on the right side of the law. It's not clear whether President Jimmy Carter knew that the stroke of his pen on House Resolution 1337 would set into motion the forces that would eventually lead to the creation of the U.S. craft brewing industry, but that is basically what happened. As one underground brewer after another came out into the light of day and saw people enjoying the unorthodox, flavorful beers that they made, they got to thinking, those people might pay for those beers. And the rest was, history. Joining Taplines to help us unpack this history is a man who was brewing in basements since way before old Jimmy Cardigan got involved, Charlie Papazian. He's the founder of both the American Homebrew Association and the Association of Brewers, and is the author of The Complete Joy of Homebrewing, which is now in its 4th edition and has sold over 1 million copies worldwide. Charlie is a living legend in the American craft brewing industry, and he was kind enough to come on the show and out of his well-earned retirement to tell us what it was like homebrewing through that heady era. It's Charlie Papazian, it's barely legal homebrewing, it's craft beer's Oval Office origin story, and it's all right here, right now, on VinePair's Taplines. Well, thank you so much for joining us here on Taplines, Charlie.
Oh, thanks for having me.
Charlie, where are you joining us from today?
I'm in Boulder County, Colorado.
And you have long history in Boulder. You are not a newcomer to Boulder like so many people have been over the course of the past couple of years. How long have you lived in Boulder?
Yeah, I've been here 50 years.
Wow, 50 years, man.
So I've seen a lot of changes.
Yeah, I bet. Well, we have you here on Taplines today to talk about a significant change, speaking of which. As we do here at Taplines, we're looking to tell the story of the modern history of beer in America. And when we think about major milestones that sort of unleashed the craft brewing movement in this country and changed the face of American beer, one that sticks out is a pivotal moment that you not only lived through, but played a part in ushering into being. And I'm talking, of course, about Jimmy Carter's decision to sign H.R. 1337, which removed a lot of the federal level restrictions on homebrewing in America. Charlie, let's start with where you were when you heard the news, maybe. Why don't we start with the very, at the beginning, or maybe even before the beginning? Do you had a career in homebrewing prior to Jimmy Carter's decision to change the federal government's posture towards homebrewing? Can you tell me a little bit about what you were doing and your homebrewing career thus far at that stage?
Yeah, I moved to Boulder in the early 70s and ended up getting a teacher's job, a job teaching kids. And at the same time, I was talked into by an organization called the Community Free School here in Boulder, Colorado at the time. to teach a course in beer making. I called it Log Boom Brewing. It was a home brewing class, and I did that for 10 years. And over that period of time, there was about 1,000 people that took my class, which I gave out of the house that I was renting at the time. And all kinds of people would come through, and that's where I really learned how to make beer. I actually started making beer when I was a college student at the University of Virginia. And we can talk a little bit about that a little later in the program, perhaps, about
Yeah.
what kind of beer that was. But that's what I carried over to my move to Colorado. And that's what I started with. And having a class, uh, small classes in the beginning, I began experimenting in the class. So it was a learning experience, not only for the people that were taking the class, it was a learning experience for all of us. And we started experimenting with different kinds of malt extracts and specialty grains. And, we didn't have much choice in yeast, but the fun part was that we were experimenting with how to enjoy it. And so that was what kept us going. Um, and in the late 70s, I had decided to, with a friend of mine called Charlie Matson, who was one of the people that took my class, we decided to start an organization that we called American Homebrewers Association, Zymergy Magazine. And unbeknownst to us, this was we came out with our first issue of Zymergy Magazine in December of 1978. But unbeknownst to us, when we had this idea to start the publication, we didn't have any idea that legalizing home brewing was in the works.
Yeah.
And we were starting this organization, and I've been teaching beer making classes when homebrew was not legal. So, but that didn't stop us. We just did what we did, and we figured the ATF at the time, Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, had better things to do than bust homebrewers.
Sure.
Which was the case.
And they more or less said as much. I mean, I think, I was reading up on Tom Acitelli's, excellent history of craft brewing in this country, the audacity of hops, and he had quoted an ATF agent at the time. I mean, he was obviously referring to, a secondary source in the newspaper or somewhere, but the ATF, had said that it was a low priority item for us. That was the quote that they gave. And, I know that was not, of course, something that they were interested in doing, is coming and busting down your door. But I imagine that it being illegal was maybe still on your mind to some extent, or did that not really factor into your decision to get further into the home brewing practice?
This was in a time, it was the mid 70s. Let's peg it at the mid 70s. And a lot of the people everybody that was taking the class was really interested in doing something new, something revolutionary, something themselves, and improving the status of beer and making better beer. So, the fact that it was illegal was kind of a plus. You referred to the legislation that was signed into law. It's a transportation bill, actually, and there was an amendment in this transportation bill that legalized home brewing on the federal level.
Mm-hmm.
And I remember after we discovered that this was going to happen, and it did happen, there were comments by some of the people that were taking my class. They basically said, well, I hope it's just as much fun as when it was illegal as it's going to be when it's legal.
Right. So there was a counterculture appeal to this practice before. Yeah.
It was.
Yeah.
And I was, I had been featured in many newspaper articles and feature stories in the Colorado area. I've been on nightly news casts about this guy in Boulder, Colorado, that was teaching people how to make beer, and that it was illegal, but we were doing it anyway. And but it really didn't bother me that much. It wasn't something that was hanging over us. But, one of the things that did happen with the legalization of home brewing is that it provided a safe harbor for homebrew shops, which they didn't promote themselves as homebrew shops in those days. There were no homebrew supply stores.
Sure.
There was home winemaking supply stores, and they sold this. But if they were going to promote home brewing, which was illegal, they were anxious about losing their business.
Sure. That was kind of like at the head shops before marijuana legalization became more widespread. They would have tobacco pipes, right? Those pipes are only for tobacco, not for anything else. Wink, wink, nudge, nudge. But the fact that there was home wine fermenting shops, home winemaking shops, speaks to a holdover from Prohibition, if I'm not mistaken, right? Wine was not legislated or restricted in the same, home wine production was not restricted in the same way as spirits and beer production. So, I mean, if my history is right, I'm relying on Dan Okrent's Last Call is the history that I go with for most of my Prohibition knowledge. But there were winemaking, packets that, people were getting from California and yeast packets and grape concentrate packets that they were producing even during Prohibition. And then after Prohibition, the law carved out, that practice for home winemaking, but not for home brewing. And so we find you, a younger Charlie Papazian, in the mid 70s, and you're homebrewing. You're not too worried about the fact that it exists in this gray area. When you started Zymurgy magazine, so you didn't know that there was a legislative effort to reform the laws around homebrewing. This was just a serendipitous coincidence that the AHA came to be and the magazine came to be right around the same time that the federal government was making that revision.
Well, the decision to go forward with this whole project was before we knew about the legislation that was going to change things. But we did feature. We found space in the magazine, the very Volume 1, Number 1, to put in. There's a pretty detailed story about the legalization of home brewing and who was responsible for it. The senators in California and elsewhere that sponsored the amendment. So we did find out about it at the last minute, and we included the story in the first issue of the magazine.
Who was, to your memory, who was the major, or who were the major political allies of this this little tuck-in in the transportation bill that got passed? I think Alan Cranston, a senator out of California, was pretty instrumental. Does that name ring a bell? Were there were there others? Yeah,
there were others. There's. The magazine is about 4 feet from me. I could look it up for you if you wanted. But there was another senator from the Midwest that was involved. And, there were a lot of, it was politics as usual. Sure. And there were some East Coast and West Coast negotiations and discussions, and it got through. And from what I understand, it was the winemaking supply stores that some of the higher profile people that made it happen.
Yeah, gotcha. So it gets passed, and it doesn't mean that all homebrewing restrictions have been removed, because, of course, in the United States, alcohol gets regulated largely at the state level, not at the federal level. After Prohibition, we all learned our lesson about the federal government controlling the alcohol trade. And the American people said, let's give that power back to the states. And we wind up with a 50-state patchwork of alcohol regulations, many of which pertain to homebrewing. I know that the AHA, the organization that you founded in 1978, would go on under your stewardship many years later to continue to fight the battle at the state level to remove restrictions for home brewing. And I think you and your team and the group there wound up accomplishing that midway through this past decade. I think it was 2013, was it?
I believe so. Is it somewhere at Mississippi and Alabama were the last two states
The
after all
last
those?
holdouts. Yeah. But that's, of course, at this point, that's when we're looking at the history where we're at right now. That's way, way in the future. I mean, you're in 1978, early 1979. Zimmergy magazine is just, the first edition you guys have published. The AHA is in its infancy. What happens from there? You mentioned that the ability for homebrewing retail to really take root was a key turning point or a key outcome of this changed law. Can you speak to that a little bit? What was the significance there, and what transpired from it?
Sure. Well, with the legalization, the home winemaking stores could call themselves home wine and beer making supply stores, and eventually home brew shops. And what resulted with that transition was that more people were turned on to the hobby, and there was more turnover of ingredients, and subsequently the ingredients became fresher, and there was more variety, and more people got into the business. And various malt extract companies were sprang up or began being imported into the United States from the UK, from Ireland, from Germany, from Canada. And also, over a period of time, the quality of hops improved dramatically, because in the original days, if anyone saw what we were using for hops, they said, where did they come from? A dust on the floor or something? It was just horrible. It was brown and crumbly. I mean, it could have been old cardboard for all we knew. But that's hops in the old days.
No fresh hopping in the technique back then. That was not a thing back then.
Yeah. And, from all that, homebrew shops get more popular. Homebrew clubs started springing up. People were sponsored by clubs were sponsored by shops. And, the exchange of information became accelerated, and we all improved our beer.
What was going on at that time with regards to the exchange of information? This is something that I was really curious about. Obviously, the magazine is a big, channel through which you're communicating with your members and with other folks who are interested in homebrewing. What were other media that you were using at the time? I mean, were physical newsletters a thing? Were you guys doing conventions and meetups to exchange ideas? What were the dominant methods of that information sharing that you're describing? I mean, this is pre-internet, which,
right.
I understand that people communicated before the internet. Of course, I'm not a child of the internet. I was born in '88, so I didn't exist before the internet existed, or I existed before that. But I'm curious to know, I mean, this is technical stuff. This is important information that really is at the core of homebrewing, because it's a technical, it's an art and a science together. How are you communicating that information?
Yeah, well, in those days, in the '70s, let's just say in the mid '70s, we can progress through the mid '80s and '90s, but mid '70s, there was no dependable quality information about beer and brewing. I mean, if you wanted a book on the subject, there were a few homebrew books for a couple of bucks you could get, including one of my original Joy of Brewing, which was pretty basic information, and a lot of the information was based on English homebrewing, which was a whole different circumstance. And we didn't want to make cheap beer. We want to make good beer. And that was the major difference between the information that existed and the information we wanted. So, and this is something, you were asking in a prior discussion about, what were some of the fundamental cultural shifts that happened back then that really influence where we are today. And I have to say that because there was no information, we had to rely on our own experiences, and we had to share those experiences. And those experiences were successes as well. They were our failures, and we weren't ashamed to share our failures as well. So the exchange of information was essential for all of us to kind of pull ourselves up by our bootstraps and make better beer. And that, today is called collaboration. In those days, we just simply were sharing information. And Zymergy magazine, that's still published by the American Home Brewers Association,
Mm-hmm.
was the only nationally distributed and available communication that kind of connected this very fragile network of people who wanted to make better beer and drink better beer. That was the
Yep.
only thing around in those days. So
Yep.
how do we do that? We met locally. We got on the telephone. We wrote each other letters and notes, and we mailed each other things. And we read them, and we experimented, and we failed, and sometimes we succeeded, and we shared that information. We tasted our beer, and we wondered what we were tasting, and out of that came this whole "how do you judge beer" movement that emerged out of the Home Brewers Association. And so that
Sure.
cultural shift is still with us today. I mean, people are still, around the world are very impressed. In the early days, they were flabbergasted that people were actually sharing their recipes and sharing their information and how to make beer. And that kind of translated into the professional microbrewing, craft brewing movement as well. And you
Sure.
see you see that a lot of collaboration. And before home brewers and microbrewers and craft brewers existed, none of that existed. Brewers were very secretive. They wouldn't even allow another brewer into their brewery. I mean, they
Mm-hmm.
were so secretive and so scared about trade secrets, which there were no really trade secrets, but there was this mentality of cutthroat competition and not sharing one iota of information.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, because I mean, prior we're talking post-prohibition here, but pre-craft brewing movement in the U.S. I mean, it was a consolidating commodity game. I obviously didn't live through that, but I know my history to some extent, and I've reported, spoke with people who were there for it, and yeah, you make the joke that there were no trade secrets, right? Everyone was playing the same game: light adjunct lager, put it on a refrigerated rail car, and get it to as many markets as possible. And the game was really more about marketing than it was about
Yeah.
the
Beer.
the composition of the liquid, the brewing of the beer itself. So that alone was, I mean, you were pulling against the tide. You and your cohorts, your peers at the time in the homebrewing community, were pulling against the tide just in with regards to the full flavored liquid that you guys were brewing. I am curious to know, I have so many additional questions here. I'm curious to know, when you talk about like the actual liquid that you were brewing, what were you brewing the most of at that time? Were you doing small batches of every different thing? Were you honing in on a particular style? Were you brewing for your own palate, for your friends? Like, what was governing your sort of like exploratory, brewing practice at that time?
Yeah, in the earliest of days, it was, you might call it prohibition style home brewing. It was a dump and stir recipe with cans of hop flavored malt extract you got at the supermarket, and you stirred that in with a lot of sugar
Mm.
and whatever yeast you could find, and hope for the best. No boil, and it was good enough that we stuck with it. But we once we began exploring and visiting a few breweries, and brewers kind of shared their information. There was these things called boiling the wort and adding hops and things like that, rather than using just the canned extra hop flavored extract.
Right. Right.
So what were we brewing when in the let's say during the 70s, we were brewing pale ales, India pale ale. We were brewing English style ales mostly.
Mm.
Lagering was not really accessible to us because we didn't have the experience and the expertise to cold lager, and we didn't have the access to lager yeast.
I was
That's
gonna
for
say, and
sure.
you also didn't have the caves. You didn't have
No,
a
we didn't have
bigger.
to pay, and we didn't. Who's going to go out and buy a refrigerator to lager their beer when you didn't have any lager? The only thing we had was something that came in a foil package, unlabeled foil package called ale yeast. Who the
Right.
heck knew what that was?
Right.
So it was mostly the British. We were inspired by the Brits their home brewing books, and we discovered things like stouts and porters and pale ales and bitters and miles and brown ales. So that's what we were making in those days. And then we began experimenting with things that were in the kitchen: herbs, spices, fruits, honey, brown sugar, uh, all kinds of concoctions that in those days were considered blasphemous by professional brewers. I
Sure.
mean, it was like, you can't even call that, you're putting honey in your beer. You can't call that beer.
Yeah.
That was the attitude.
Yeah.
And so, and I think there was a pivotal point, a paradigm shift, when Michael Jackson came out with his book, The World Guide to Beer, around the late 70s, 1978, 79. It was available in the United States. And we discovered Michael Jackson in his book, and he exposed the world of German style beers and Belgian style beers, and the history of American style beers, beers from other parts of Europe and Australia, etc. And so there was this, you were drooling with, thirsting with every page that you read in this book, and we started trying to figure out, well, how can we possibly make some of these beers? And through people's experiences with traveling and tasting, we gained the knowledge to begin making these kinds of beers.
Yeah. Yeah. Was there a particular recipe or a particular beer that you were making at that time that has, in your opinion, withstood the test of time, that you're still brewing from time to time? Is there one or several of them that you feel like have held up over the years? Or all of them, maybe?
there's a, personally, my beer tastes evolve, and my brewing habits have changed, and my equipment hasn't changed very much. I'm still a very hands-on home brewer. But in the old days, I was making lots of ales, English style ales, which I still love, and they're harder to find in pubs these days.
Mm-hmm.
So that's the value of home brewing for me these days, is I can make the beers that I can't find elsewhere, which is, the porters, the stouts, the English style bitter and mild. But the things that have withstood the test of time have been, I think, the pale ales and the India pale ales. Those are recipes that we developed in the early days, when the only hop that we could get that was unique and fit our home brewing personality was the introduction of Cascade hops. Before then, there were no real aromatic hops or hops that gave off any kind of aroma. And all of a sudden, when we discovered we could get fresh Cascade hops, we started dry hopping, not in the traditional sense that English brewers would dry hop, but dry hopping in the American way, and making American style pale ales. And that's where you get these American style pale ales and American style IPAs. And that all evolved because we really loved hops. And I think the home brewers in the United States and the craft brewers in the United States really opened the world to the whole aromatic and flavor experience of hops, which didn't exist back before home brewing took off in its mid 70s and early 80s.
Sure. And now we just take it, an American drinker who enters the craft beer, ecosystem or marketplace at any point after, 2012 or so, is encountering hoppy beers en masse as a matter of course. I mean, this is just, it maybe more than any one style, the India Pale Ale, West Coast style India Pale Ale, has defined, American craft beer, for better or for worse, for an entire generation of drinkers. But at the time, that was not the case.
It's right. And it's, home brewers and American craft brewers have, redefined what an IPA is several times.
Many times over. Yeah, exactly.
All kinds of variations. And, when I go into a pub or a tap room and there's like 7 or 8 or 9 different IPAs and there's not much other choice, I usually, my tastes have drifted towards sessionable beers, beers that I can have a few of and still do other things afterwards. And so I migrated to uh, milder beers, English style bitters, and also German style lagers, and which I brew at home. And it just, they're much more sessionable. You don't end up talking about the beer the whole conversation. You talk about
Sure.
life, which is what the social network has always been in pubs, historically. And that's where there's, beers different things to different people, and even myself, I've evolved.
Sure. Charlie, at the time, obviously you didn't know what the American Homebrewing Association was going to turn into. You didn't know that the complete joy of homebrewing, which you've been very modest about, you mentioned in passing, but it's your book, your some would call it the definitive text on homebrewing, which has sold well north of 1 million copies. But at the time, it was, you were writing the first edition of it. It's now gone on to be printed 4 times. You didn't know any of that at the time, but you moved from 1978, early 1979. The law changes. You've formed the AHA. You've launched the magazine. You moved from your homebrewing practice into a life of what you might call advocacy, or becoming a proponent of craft brewing, or excuse me, of home brewing, and to some extent craft brewing as well. Your colleagues or your peers at the time, many of them went on to found breweries that we all, or many of us know today, that had their household names for other reasons. You're a household name in the beer industry because of all of your work with the AHA and with the Brewers Association. But you had, folks in your circle at the time who went on to form breweries that the American drinking public would know today. Do you still keep up with your old homebrewing pals, the ones that are still in the game? I'm curious to know you mentioned the social network, what the social network looks like now, all these years later.
Uh, yeah. Let's see. I'm not sure what the what the question is, but um,
Well, here, let me rephrase it another way. I mean, what were some of the other, the brewers that you were homebrewing at the time? What did they go on to do? I mean, I think if I remember correctly, you may have brewed with someone who went on to found Wynkoop Brewery, went on to found, I think, New Belgium. You brewed with someone who went
yeah,
on to found
yeah.
New
They
Belgium.
were
But
they were all there were quite a number of people that took my beer classes that started their own breweries in the Colorado area. New Belgium was one. The people at Wynkoop, the original brewer there, took my class. Um, so things evolve, and when I travel around, um, I say, when I meet brewers anywhere, I'd say 95% of the brewers in my past travels always mentioned that they had their roots in home brewing,
yeah,
that they
yeah,
started out home brewing and they evolved to become a professional, whether they were a brewer or an engineer or a marketing person or a manager. A lot of them started out with my book, and I find that there's an inordinate, for me, it's just an amazing amount of people that are in the profession that started out with my book. And the thing that I tried to instill with people who would read my book was that the information had foundation in science, good science, and the presentation was very practical, but also that it was fun and enjoyable. Like, the hobby is enjoyable. So I would say that a lot of people that start out with my book stuck with it more than you would expect, because I try to instill that have fun with this. Don't relax, don't worry, have a homebrew was the motto that encapsulated the culture of have fun with this, share it with friends, get them going, and don't. And the other thing I tell people is, like, don't overcomplicate things. Yeah, sure, get into the gadgets, get into the hops, get in the malt and the yeast, but don't get to a point where you leave the hobby because it's gotten so complicated and involved for you.
yeah.
Um, keep it simple, make great beer. And, I still stay in touch with brewers. I go to a few local breweries, tap rooms here in the Boulder County area, and
Hmm.
always running into people that I've worked with, that I've had beers with before or have collaborated with. There's always a story to be told and people to meet wherever I go. I was recently at a conference in Southeast Asia, in Thailand, Bangkok, Thailand, and I met people that started out with my book, that are now managers in Hong Kong or brewing in India, or even have a taproom brewery in Thailand. So it's when you're introduced to something that instills a spirit of fun and enjoyment, you stay with it a long time.
Yeah, yeah. What's, as we think about sort of where the craft brewing industry and where the home brewing industry, has gone since the late 70s, early 80s, that period we're talking about, it's gone in a million different directions, of course. It's come a long way, as we've mentioned, in terms of, style, but also, breadth and depth, and, in industry maturation, whatever, basically in every regard. To the point where, the average drinker, I think today, the ones that I talk to and I'm out, reporting, don't necessarily make a connection between home brewing and, the craft beer that they see on supermarket shelves these days. It's become much more of a legitimate, sort of mainstream product. And in one regard, that's great, because that represents a level of success, of getting that adoption that, at the time, you guys, that was unheard of. You were kind of just doing this as a fringe thing, right? But on the other hand, it's maybe a little bit of a disconnect from its historical roots, from those roots, of home brewing back in the period that you were working on it with your friends in the basement in Boulder, or in Charlottesville when you were there. What's like, if you had to tell someone, or you find yourself speaking with a drinker who has no, context for that history, for that period in the late 70s, what's like one thing you'd like people to know about what it was like during that period, before craft beer, before homebrewing was really even a known quantity, before it had been codified and turned into this thing that everyone loves? I'm curious to know, what you think gets lost in the conversation or gets overlooked for today's younger drinkers.
Yeah, there's no way to to impress upon people how difficult it was to even get people to try craft beer, microbrewed beer, home brewing. I
Yeah,
mean, just the color would turn them off. It would be amber, and they would call it
sure.
dark. It would have this strange taste that they didn't recognize what it was, so it was no good. But it was the hops that they were tasting.
Yeah, yeah.
Um, it was extraordinarily difficult, for getting beer drinkers to try something different. It was even harder to get beer distributors to carry your beer. And it was even harder for the distributors to get, if you had craft beer, it was harder to get retail stores to sell it, because nobody had any faith that this so-called trend was going to be long lasting. They
Yep.
said, why do we need another beer? We got Bud, Miller, and Coors. What do we need more for?
Well, and
That was
if
the
they're really special, they had Heineken, maybe.
yeah. I mean, there was the import section of a liquor store, or where they sold beer, was one refrigerator, glass stored refrigerator, with Guinness, Heineken, Beck's, St. Pauli Girls, and maybe one Mexican beer
Yeah.
and an Irish stout. Guinness.
Harp. Yeah, yeah. Something. Yeah, right. Yeah.
It was really difficult. And
Yeah.
we've had some difficult times recently. I mean, we've had COVID, and we've had other things to happen, recessions and things like that. But it was never as difficult as it was back in the 80s. I mean,
Yeah.
COVID was a challenge, but there was even though you didn't know much about the virus in the beginning, you had beer, you knew how to make it, you knew how to adapt your business. Maybe, there were options available to you. In the early days, there was no options other than just educating people on what you were doing and why. And here, try this.
Yeah, yeah. You're coming from first principles. Yeah, yeah, yeah. Yeah, a different time. Last question for you, Charlie. But one of the when you read the history, and or certainly when I do, and when I speak with sources, the Jimmy Carter's decision in 1978, early 1979, that removes restrictions on homebrewing is often pointed to as the in hindsight the moment that launches the craft brewing movement in earnest in this country. I'm
Sure.
curious, as someone like yourself who lived through that period and who was really there, at ground zero, so to speak, for this entire movement, in founding the AHA and in going on to launch the magazine and write the book and do all the advocacy, the work that you did. Do you think of that moment that we're discussing? Do you think of that in such a pivotal way? Is there another moment that you think of that it was equally significant but doesn't get as much attention? Like, I'm curious to know how you contextualize this, that decision, Carter's decision, in your craft beer history and how significant you think it is.
Well, in retrospect, it was quite significant, but at the time, we had no idea.
It was a blip. Yeah.
We had no
Yeah.
idea. It was like, oh man, they legalized it. It's not going to be as much fun anymore. That's kind of the attitude we had. We didn't know the implications. We just carried on. But, slowly we realized that, fresh ingredients were more available. The hobby expanded. More people got involved. You know, were there moments that were there other paradigm shifts? I think of the time in the probably mid 80s, late 80s, that we were onto something when Miller Brewing Company came out with a stout. Now, they advertised Miller Lite and then they come out with a stout. It was a short-lived experiment on their part, but that was a pivotal moment for me. And when one of the big brewers made a honey beer, it was the big brewers that were bashing us in the old days. You can't put honey in beer. That's not beer. And
Sure.
they started to make honey beer. They started calling their, making some pale ale type beers, and they were O'Doul's, which is a non-alcoholic beer made by Anheuser-Busch. Originally, O'Doul's was a pale ale, an experimental beer that was made in New Hampshire. The brewery
Is that right?
Yeah, that's right. They came out with O'Doul's and a Märzen, Oktoberfest beer.
Sure,
the O'Doul
sure.
brand still lives on, but it's non-alcoholic. But it was originally a pale ale, and those little things that happened in my mind was like, all right, they're noticing. Things are going to change. They're changing slowly, but it's happening. And
Sure.
you walk, the Great American Beer Festival, something I founded in 1982. I've been to every one of them since. It's this, it's a measure of an evolution over the many, many years. The kinds of people who would come, and the behavior of the people, which is always enthusiastic, but in the early days, it was mostly homebrewers that would come, and now mainstream comes, and people just discover beer because they really understand what this is all about, which we had no idea that it was going to be so mainstream. And we've lost, like you inferred earlier, you lose some things, you gain other things. There's a lot of craft beer brands are kind of mass produced now. Does that make them better or worse? Well, let the beer drinker decide. I mean, I personally I'll drink a good craft beer no matter who makes it, but I prefer to visit my local tap rooms in the area, and I love the beers that they make.
Or brew it yourself.
Or brew it myself, which I still brew pretty regularly, about once a month at least. And I got a couple of lagers lagering right now, as well as a few ales on tap.
Yeah. You think you'll ever give it up? Too much hassle? Just let someone else brew your beer for you?
No, I'm not. I might, but I don't have any intention to, because the beers I make are unique enough and delicious enough that can't get them anywhere else except my place.
Fair enough. Taplines is recorded in Richmond, Virginia, and produced by yours truly and Darby Seaside, who, along with the talented Shane Farrick, composed our delightful soundtrack. Just listen to it. I also want to give a quick shout out to the entire Vine Pair team, and especially co-founders Adam Teeter and Josh Mellon, editor-in-chief Joanna Sherino, managing editor Tim McCurdy, and art director Danielle Grinberg, who designed our lovely Taplines logo. And of course, a big thank you to you, yes you listener, for spending time with us week in and week out. We literally couldn't do this without you. I'm Dave Infante, and I'll catch you next time.